The American medic crouched in the mud, staring at the German soldier's wound. The infection had turned the flesh black at the edges. The fever, when he checked it moments ago, read 106 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, brain damage begins. Organ failure follows. The German's eyes were half open, delirious, muttering words in a language the medic didn't understand. In his pack, the American carried 6 vials of penicillin, enough to save perhaps 3 men if rationed carefully. His own unit had 12 wounded waiting for treatment. 12 Americans who had fought beside him, bled beside him, trusted him to keep them alive. 3 hours earlier, this same German soldier might have been the one who fired the mortar round that killed his friend. Now he lay dying of an infection that American medicine could cure with a simple injection. The medic's hand hovered over his medical bag, 5 milligrams of crystalline powder suspended in solution. That's all it would take. His training said, save him. His rage said, let him die. His exhaustion said, walk away and let God decide. This is the story of a single medical decision made in the winter of 1945. But it's really about the moment when human instinct collided with human hatred, when professional duty confronted personal loss, when one exhausted soldier had to choose between the man he wanted to be and the man war had tried to make him, and what it reveals about the gap between what we believe about ourselves in peacetime and who we actually become when killing is not just permitted but required, when the enemy is not an abstraction but a dying human being whose life rests literally in our hands. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge had shattered what remained of the comfortable illusion that the war was nearly over. Hitler's last desperate counter-offensive had caught the Allied forces completely unprepared, and now, in the frozen forests of Belgium, American units were fighting for survival against a German army that everyone had assumed was finished. The weather was apocalyptic. Temperatures dropped to -20 Fahrenheit. Snow fell so thick that air support was grounded, supply lines were cut, and entire battalions became isolated in forests that swallowed sound and hope with equal efficiency. Corporal William Brennan, 23 years old, from a small town in Ohio whose name wouldn't mean anything to anyone who hadn't grown up there, had been serving as a combat medic with the 99th Infantry Division for 7 months. 7 months that felt like 7 years. 7 months during which he had learned that the human body contained more blood than seemed possible, that men screamed for their mothers regardless of what language they spoke, and that morphine was more precious than gold because it was the only thing standing between wounded men and agony that would drive them insane. Brennan had been raised to believe certain things, that Americans were the good guys, that Germans were the enemy but still human, that doctors and medics existed outside the machinery of killing, that the Red Cross on his helmet meant something universal, something that transcended nationality and politics. His training at Fort Sam Houston had been clear. Treat the wounded without regard to uniform. The Geneva Convention said so. Christian morality said so. Basic human decency said so. These principles had seemed obvious, even noble, when discussed in a clean classroom in Texas. Then he arrived in Europe and discovered what war actually meant. Not the sanitized version from newsreels, not the heroic narratives from radio broadcasts, but the grinding, exhausting, traumatizing reality of young men killing each other in the mud. He learned that enemy soldiers did not look like monsters. They looked like the kids he'd gone to high school with, just wearing different colored uniforms and speaking words he couldn't understand. He learned that when you treated a wounded German prisoner, he would thank you with his eyes, even if he couldn't speak English, and that gratitude felt exactly the same as when you saved an American. But he also learned hatred, real hatred, not the cartoon version from propaganda posters. He learned it the day his best friend, Tommy Chen, a 20-year-old kid from San Francisco who wanted to be an architect and who drew buildings in the margins of his letters home, stepped on a mine that turned him into a red mist and a scream that ended too quickly. He learned it every time he held pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Watching the life drain out of men whose names he knew, whose families he'd heard about, whose futures had just been cancelled by a piece of metal moving faster than sound. The battle that led to his impossible choice began just after dawn on December 19, 1944. Brennan's unit was dug into a defensive position near a village whose name appeared on maps, but no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Just ruins and frozen mud and the smell of cordite that never quite left your nostrils. They'd been awake for 36 hours. Sleep was a luxury no one could afford because German patrols probed their lines constantly, and falling asleep on watch meant everyone died. The attack came with the sunrise, not because the Germans were poetic, but because the early morning light made it harder for the Americans to see them emerging from the tree line. Mortars first, the distinctive crump, crump, crump of shells being walked across their position with methodical German precision. Then small arms fire, the crack of Mauser rifles mixing with the deeper bark of American M1 Garands. Then the real nightmare, the sound every infantry soldier feared most. The mechanical scream of MG-42 machine guns firing so fast the shots blurred into a single continuous roar that could cut a man in half. Brennan spent the next 4 hours doing what he'd been trained to do, what he'd done dozens of times before, what had stopped feeling heroic months ago, and now just felt like an exhausting race against bleeding and shock and the simple mechanical failure of human tissue. Sulfur powder on wounds to prevent infection, morphine for pain, pressure bandages to stop bleeding. Plasma if they had it, prayer if they didn't. He moved through the chaos with the detached efficiency of a man who had learned that thinking about what he was seeing would make him useless, and useless medics meant dead soldiers. Private Jenkins took shrapnel to the chest, sucking chest wound, air bubbling through torn lung tissue. Brennan sealed it, knowing Jenkins had maybe a 30% chance if they could evacuate him within 6 hours. Sergeant Morrison lost most of his left leg to a mortar. Brennan applied the tourniquet, injected the morphine, held Morrison's hand, while the sergeant cried not from pain, but from the sudden knowledge that his life as he'd known it was over at age 24. Corporal Davis took a round through the abdomen. Brennan did what he could, which wasn't much, and watched Davis die over the course of 20 minutes, conscious and terrified for most of it. By noon, the German attack had been repulsed, but the word victory would have been obscene. The American position held, but at a cost that made holding it feel like losing. 15 dead, 23 wounded, and ammunition stocks so low that the next attack might break through simply because they'd run out of bullets. The Germans had withdrawn to their own positions, leaving their dead and some of their wounded scattered across the frozen ground between the two lines. No man's land, they called it, and the name was precise. It belonged to no one because anyone who entered it became a target. Standard procedure in situations like this was to wait until dark, then conduct recovery operations under the cover of darkness. Retrieve your own wounded first, your own dead second, and leave enemy casualties unless they could be easily secured as prisoners. But winter darkness came early this far north, and temperatures at night were dropping to levels where wounded men would die from exposure before dawn. So both sides had developed an informal, unspoken protocol. Temporary truces to retrieve casualties, marked by soldiers standing up slowly, keeping weapons pointed down, moving carefully to avoid any gesture that might be interpreted as aggression. Brennan was part of the 4-man team that went out that afternoon. 2 riflemen for security, 2 medics for treatment and evacuation. They moved slowly across the churned mud and snow, checking bodies, looking for signs of life. Most of what they found was beyond help. War produces corpses far more efficiently than it produces survivable wounds. But they found 3 living Americans, unconscious but breathing, and they dragged them back to the line one by one. Slow, exhausting work made harder by the cold and the weight and the constant awareness that somewhere in the German positions, soldiers with rifles were watching every move. On their final sweep, Brennan found the German. He was maybe 19 years old, though the infection and fever made age hard to judge. A shell fragment had torn through his lower leg 3 or 4 days earlier, based on the state of the wound. Someone, probably the German's own medic, had bandaged it initially, but the bandage was fouled now, soaked through with pus and the distinctive smell of gangrenous infection. The soldier's face was flushed with fever, his breathing rapid and shallow, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Brennan checked his pulse, racing over 140 beats per minute. the heart trying desperately to compensate for the infection ravaging the body. He checked the pupils, responsive but sluggish, a sign of the confusion that comes with extreme fever. He did a quick blood pressure check with the portable cuff he carried. The numbers were bad, indicating the early stages of septic shock. Without treatment, the German would be dead by morning. With treatment, even basic treatment, he might survive. The rules were clear. Geneva Convention, Article 12. Members of the armed forces who are wounded or sick shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. They shall be treated humanely and cared for by the party to the conflict in whose power they may be, without any adverse distinction founded on sex, race, nationality, religion, political opinions, or any other similar criteria. The language was precise because the principle was supposed to be absolute. You didn't get to choose who to save based on which flag they fought for. But Brennan stood there in the frozen mud, staring at the dying German, and discovered that principles taught in classrooms feel different when filtered through exhaustion and trauma and rage. This soldier wore the same uniform as the men who had killed Tommy Chen. He spoke the same language as the sniper who had shot Private Williams through the throat 2 weeks ago. He fought for the same country that had started this entire nightmare, that had built the concentration camps, that had made genocide into industrial policy. The 2 riflemen with him didn't say anything. They just watched, weapons ready, faces carefully neutral. They knew the rules. They also knew that accidents happened in war, that wounded enemy soldiers died from their injuries all the time, that no one back at headquarters would question a report that said the German was already dead when they found him. They would support whatever Brennan decided, because that's what unit cohesion meant. They would lie for him if he asked. They would tell the truth if he insisted. But they wouldn't make the choice for him. Brennan's medical bag contained 6 vials of penicillin, the miracle drug they called it, though miracle seemed like the wrong word for something humans had invented in a laboratory. Penicillin was barely 3 years old, as a mass-produced medicine. Before 1942, infections like the one ravaging this German soldier were death sentences. Surgery could sometimes help by cutting away the infected tissue, but more often it just meant amputating limbs in a desperate race to stay ahead of the spreading bacteria. Sulfur drugs provided some help, but they were nowhere near as effective as penicillin. The discovery that a common mold could produce a substance that killed bacteria without harming human tissue was one of those accidents that changed history. Alexander Fleming had noticed it in 1928, but turning that observation into usable medicine required 15 more years of research, industrial development, and eventually the full weight of American pharmaceutical manufacturing capability. By 1944, penicillin production had reached levels that allowed frontline medics to carry it, though supplies were still limited enough that every vial had to be justified, logged, and accounted for. Each vial contained enough penicillin to begin treatment for one serious infection. Full treatment required multiple doses over several days, but even a single injection could halt the spread of bacteria long enough for the body's own immune system to begin fighting back. For the German lying in the mud, one vial might mean the difference between death by morning and survival long enough to reach a field hospital where proper care could continue. But Brennan's unit had 12 wounded Americans waiting for treatment. Not all of them needed penicillin. Some had clean wounds that would heal with basic care, but at least 3 had injuries where infection was a serious risk, and if those infections took hold, penicillin might be the only thing that saved them. Using a vial on the German meant having one less vial for his own people. It meant potentially watching an American die from an infection that he could have prevented if he'd conserved his supplies. The math was brutal, but simple. Save the enemy in front of him now, or reserve medicine for the Americans who might need it later. Certainty versus possibility, known need versus potential need, the stranger versus the brothers. Brennan knelt down beside the German, close enough now to see details. The soldier's uniform was threadbare, patched in places, the kind of wear that suggested Germany's vaunted supply system was breaking down. His boots were worn through at the sole, packed with newspaper for insulation, the improvisation of an army that was running out of everything. He wore no wedding ring, but that meant nothing. Soldiers often left jewelry at home to prevent theft or loss. There was a small photograph tucked into the band of his helmet, too folded and faded for Brennan to make out the faces. Family, probably. Everyone carried family photos. The German's eyes opened, focusing with difficulty on Brennan's face. There was no recognition there, no understanding of what was happening. The fever had pushed him too far into delirium for coherent thought. He muttered something in German, the words slurred and desperate. Brennan didn't speak German beyond a handful of words picked up from prisoners, but tone and desperation translate across all languages. The soldier knew he was dying. He was asking for help, or maybe saying goodbye to someone who wasn't there, or praying. The meaning didn't matter because Brennan couldn't understand it anyway. Here is where we need to slow down and understand something about moral decision-making under stress. In civilian life, in peacetime, in the safety of philosophy classrooms, ethical dilemmas can be discussed with careful reasoning and thoughtful consideration of principles. You can weigh competing values, consider long-term consequences, consult with others, take time to think. The luxury of deliberation makes ethics feel like a puzzle with solutions, a system of rules that, if followed carefully, will always point toward the right choice. War destroys that luxury. War gives you seconds to make decisions that peacetime people get hours to debate. War adds layers of complication that academic ethics doesn't prepare you for. It's easy to say all human life has equal value when you're not the one who has to choose between two humans. It's easy to talk about following the rules when following the rules doesn't mean betraying the people who depend on you. Brennan was facing what philosophers call a tragic choice, a situation where every option involves violating some deeply held principle. Save the German, and he potentially risks American lives by depleting limited resources. Let the German die, and he violates his medical oath, the Geneva Convention, and the basic moral principle that you don't withhold life-saving treatment based on nationality. There was no clever third option, no creative solution that satisfied everyone. Someone was going to pay a price for whatever he decided, and he had maybe 30 seconds to decide before the cold and the exposure turned even treatment into futility. What happened next happened quickly, not because Brennan had reasoned his way to certainty, but because in the end his hands made the decision before his mind finished processing it. He pulled out a vial of penicillin, broke the seal, loaded the syringe with practiced efficiency, found a vein in the German's arm, and injected the dose. 200,000 units of crystallized hope, extracted from bread mold, synthesized in American factories, carried across an ocean and now entering the bloodstream of an enemy soldier. The two riflemen watched without comment. One of them, Private Morrison, not the sergeant who'd lost his leg, but his younger cousin who'd joined up to avenge him, spat into the snow. Not in protest, not in approval, just acknowledging that something had happened that couldn't be undone. The other, Corporal Hayes, a 30-year-old former schoolteacher from Maryland who'd seen too much and talked too little, just nodded once. They helped Brennan load the German onto a stretcher, and together the four of them carried him back to the American lines. The walk back felt longer than the walk out, though the distance was identical. Carrying a wounded man adds weight, but that wasn't what made it feel longer. It was the awareness growing with each step of what Brennan had just done. He had used scarce medicine on an enemy soldier. He had prioritized a German over potential American needs. He had followed the rules, yes, but following rules that make you feel like you've betrayed your brothers doesn't feel like virtue. It feels like cowardice hiding behind regulations. When they reached the American position, Brennan transferred the German to the aid station they'd set up in the basement of a destroyed farmhouse. The battalion surgeon, Captain James Walsh, a 38-year-old veteran of North Africa and Sicily who'd gotten very good at triage and very tired of war, took one look at the patient and raised an eyebrow. He didn't ask questions. He just got to work, starting an IV line, administering fluids, checking vitals, doing what doctors do when the question of should we save this person has already been answered, and all that remains is the technical challenge of how. Brennan spent the next 6 hours treating American wounded, working through the backlog of cases that had accumulated during the battle. Infection checks, bandage changes, pain management, the endless small tasks that constituted combat medicine. He used another vial of penicillin on Private Rodriguez, a 21-year-old kid from Texas who'd taken shrapnel to the shoulder and was showing early signs of infection. He used a third vial on Corporal Stevens, whose leg wound from 3 days prior was looking suspicious despite initial treatment. That left him with 3 vials and 12 wounded Americans still in the aid station. The German survived the night. By morning his fever had dropped to 102, still dangerous, but no longer immediately life-threatening. His pulse had slowed to 110. The infection hadn't been cured. That would take days of continued treatment, but its advance had been halted. The catastrophic septic collapse had been prevented. He regained consciousness around midday, confused and disoriented, but coherent enough to understand he was in American hands, being treated by American medics, alive when he should have been dead. Walsh kept him sedated with morphine, not from cruelty but from practical necessity. A conscious prisoner required a guard, and they didn't have personnel to spare. Better to keep him comfortable and sleeping until transport to a rear area POW camp could be arranged. Standard procedure for wounded enemy prisoners: feed them, treat them, ship them out. The Geneva Convention was very specific about treatment of prisoners of war, and the American military, whatever its other faults, took those rules seriously. 2 days later, a supply convoy made it through with fresh ammunition, food and medical supplies. Among the medical supplies, 40 vials of penicillin, enough to replenish Brennan's stock and then some. The crisis he'd been worried about, the potential shortage that might cost American lives, evaporated with the arrival of those reinforcements. The choice that had felt so impossible, so tragic, turned out to be a choice without the consequences he'd feared. But that didn't make the decision retroactively easy. Brennan had made his choice without knowing the convoy was coming. He'd used that vial on the German, while believing it might mean an American would die for lack of medicine. The fact that it worked out, that no American ended up dying from an infection that penicillin could have prevented, didn't change the moral calculus of the moment. He'd still made a decision that felt like betrayal, still chosen principle over tribe, still picked the enemy over his brothers. That night, sitting in the ruins of the farmhouse, smoking a cigarette he'd gotten from Hayes, Brennan tried to explain to himself why he'd done it. The easy answer was that he'd followed the rules, obeyed the Geneva Convention, upheld his medical oath. That was true but insufficient. Plenty of medics bent those rules when they felt justified. Plenty of doctors looked the other way when wounded enemy soldiers died from convenient neglect. The military didn't court-martial medics for triaging enemy casualties lower than their own people. That was expected, even encouraged, as long as you didn't say it explicitly. The deeper answer, the one that Brennan didn't quite have words for, but felt in his exhausted bones, was about identity, about who he wanted to be versus who the war was trying to make him. He'd joined the military because his country was fighting fascism, fighting an ideology that said some humans were worth more than others based on the accident of their birth. The Nazi regime had built an entire system on the principle that Germans were superior and other peoples were expendable. They'd industrialized that belief into death camps and systematic extermination. And if Brennan had let that German die, if he'd withheld medicine based solely on nationality, he would have been acting on the same principle he claimed to be fighting against. Not to the same extreme, not with the same genocidal intent, but the underlying logic was identical. My people matter more than your people, to the point where your life has no claim on my resources or compassion. The Nazi version was monstrous in its scale and systematic cruelty, but the seed of it, the basic idea that you can sort humans into those who deserve saving and those who don't based on which flag they were born under, that seed was the same. Brennan wasn't a philosopher. He couldn't have articulated it in those terms, but he understood it instinctively. If he'd let that German die, he would have won that small battle but lost something larger. He would have preserved his medicine and his loyalty to his tribe, but he would have sacrificed his claim to be better than what he was fighting. And once you cross that line, once you accept that principle, it becomes easier to cross it again and again, until you're the kind of person who can watch preventable suffering and feel nothing, because the suffering person is wearing the wrong uniform. This is the part of war that doesn't make it into the heroic narratives. The part where being a good person requires you to help people you have excellent reasons to hate. The part where doing the right thing feels like betraying your brothers. the part where moral clarity is a luxury and every choice is stained with regret. The German was evacuated to a POW camp 3 days later, still weak but stable, his infection responding to continued antibiotic treatment. Brennan never learned his name. The German probably never learned Brennan's name either. They were just enemy soldiers who intersected briefly in a frozen forest, one of them holding the power of life and death, the other too sick to know how close he'd come to being left to die. The German would spend the rest of the war in a camp, probably in England or America, safe and bored and far from the fighting. After the war, he'd go home, rebuild his life, maybe tell his children someday about the American medic who saved him, even though he didn't have to. Or maybe he wouldn't tell that story. Maybe it would be too complicated, too heavy with moral weight. How do you explain to children that you survived because an enemy soldier chose mercy over vengeance? How do you explain that the people you'd been taught to think of as demons turned out to be capable of more compassion than your own side had shown? Brennan continued serving as a combat medic through the end of the war. He treated hundreds more wounded soldiers, American and German, Allied and enemy. He used countless more vials of penicillin, saving limbs and lives with the casual efficiency of a man who'd learned to perform miracles without thinking of them as miracles. He watched more friends die, learned to carry more grief, became progressively more exhausted and less surprised by human cruelty. He never faced another choice quite like the one in that frozen field. Or maybe he did and just doesn't remember them as distinctly, because by then he'd answered the fundamental question about who he was going to be. After that first decision, the others became easier. Not easy, but easier. Because he'd already established the principle he was going to live by. Treat the wounded, all the wounded, without the distinctions that war wanted him to make. The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945, with a German defeat that made their last major offensive also their final collapse. The war in Europe ended 4 months later with Germany's unconditional surrender. Brennan came home to Ohio, went to medical school on the GI Bill, became a family doctor in the same small town he'd left. He practiced medicine for 40 years, treating routine ailments with the same commitment he'd brought to battlefield trauma. He rarely talked about the war. Most veterans didn't. What was there to say that people who hadn't been there could understand? But sometimes, late in his life, when pressed by grandchildren who wanted to know what he'd done in the war, he would tell them about the German soldier in the snow. He'd tell them about the fever and the infection and the choice. He'd tell them that he'd used medicine that might have been needed for Americans to save an enemy's life, and then he'd explain why, trying to put into words the thing he'd understood instinctively in that frozen moment. He'd tell them that war tries to make you into something less than human. It tries to teach you that enemies aren't people, that mercy is weakness, that survival requires you to harden yourself until you can watch suffering without feeling it, and that the only way to survive war with your humanity intact is to refuse those lessons, to insist on remaining human even when being human is harder and more dangerous and makes you feel like a traitor to your own side. He'd tell them that the German soldier lived, that Brennan never learned what happened to him after the POW camp, that they were just two young men who crossed paths in the worst circumstances humans can create for each other, and that decades later, what he remembered most clearly wasn't the technical details of the treatment, wasn't the sound of the guns or the smell of the infected wound. What he remembered was the weight of the choice, the feeling of reaching into his bag and pulling out that vial of penicillin while knowing that using it might cost American lives. And he'd tell them that he'd make the same choice again, every time, because the alternative was to become the thing he'd crossed an ocean to fight. This is where we arrive at the philosophical core of this story, the part that makes it more than just an anecdote about battlefield medicine. What happened in that frozen forest in December 1944 was a microcosm of the larger moral struggle of World War II. On one level, the war was about territory and resources and political systems. But on a deeper level, it was about whether human beings could be sorted into categories of worthy and unworthy, whether nationality or race or religion could determine the value of a life. The Nazi ideology said yes. It said that some humans were Übermenschen, superior beings, and others were Untermenschen, subhuman and expendable. It built that belief into law, into policy. into industrial systems for categorizing and eliminating the people it deemed unworthy. The Holocaust was the logical endpoint of that principle, the place you arrive when you genuinely believe that some humans don't count as fully human. The Allied cause, imperfectly and inconsistently, stood for the opposite principle, that all humans have inherent worth regardless of the circumstances of their birth, that you can't sort people into those who matter and those who don't, based on race or nationality or religion. That certain rules apply to all humans because they're human, not because of what uniform they wear or what language they speak. But principles are easy to affirm in theory. They become difficult when they cost you something. It's easy to say all human life is valuable when saying so doesn't require you to sacrifice anything. The test of a principle is whether you uphold it when doing so goes against your interests, when it requires you to help people who've tried to kill you, when it means treating your enemy the way you'd want to be treated, if the situations were reversed. William Brennan, exhausted and traumatized and grieving and young, faced that test in the most direct possible way. He held in his hands the power to save or abandon a human life, and the decision cost him something real. That vial of penicillin represented security for his unit, insurance against the infections that killed men slowly and painfully. Using it on the German meant accepting risk, meant potentially watching one of his brothers die for lack of the medicine he'd given away. And he chose to save the enemy anyway, not because it was easy, not because he liked Germans or had any illusions about the regime they fought for, but because letting the German die would have meant accepting the principle he was fighting against. It would have meant sorting humans into worthy and unworthy based on nationality, which is just a less extreme version of what the Nazis did. This is what philosophers call moral consistency. It's the idea that if you claim to believe something, you have to act on that belief even when doing so is costly or difficult. Moral principles aren't real unless they shape your behavior in the moments when following them hurts. Anyone can claim to believe in human dignity when belief is free. The question is whether you still believe it when belief requires sacrifice. The uncomfortable truth is that most moral failures don't come from people who explicitly reject good principles. They come from people who claim to believe in those principles, but find reasons not to apply them when application is inconvenient. The Nazi regime didn't say human life is worthless. It said some human lives are worthless, and then defined some to exclude Jews and Roma and Slavs, and anyone else who didn't fit their criteria. Every atrocity in history has been justified by claiming that the victims weren't really fully human, didn't really deserve the protections we'd extend to people like us. And that's why Brennan's decision matters beyond that single German soldier. Because he was offered a socially acceptable reason to let someone die. He could have justified it easily, could have said the medicine was needed for Americans, that his duty was to his own people, that the German had made his choices and now had to live with the consequences. No one would have criticized him. His unit would have supported him. The military justice system wouldn't have even investigated. But he didn't take that exit. He looked at a dying human and saw a human, not a category. He treated a wound, not a nationality. He upheld the principle that medical care doesn't depend on which side you're fighting for, even though upholding that principle felt like betrayal. And in doing so, he demonstrated something essential about what it means to maintain your humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. War creates environments where atrocity becomes normal, where killing is not just permitted but required, where the usual moral rules are suspended in the name of necessity. In that environment, the only way to remain human is to insist on certain absolute limits, certain lines you won't cross, regardless of the circumstances. For Brennan, that line was medical care. He decided that he would treat all wounded, period, without distinction. That wasn't naivety, and it wasn't weakness. It was the conscious choice to preserve something inside himself that war wanted to destroy. It was the decision that there were some things more important than tactical advantage, some principles more fundamental than winning. The German soldier whose life he saved almost certainly never knew the weight of that decision. He never knew that Brennan had friends who'd been killed by Germans, that using penicillin on him meant potentially risking American lives, that mercy came at a cost. From the German's perspective, he got sick, passed out, and woke up in an American hospital. Just the random luck of war, the fortune of being found and treated instead of dying alone in the snow. But Brennan knew. He carried that knowledge for the rest of his life, not with pride exactly, though he didn't regret it, more with a kind of somber awareness of what war asks people to become and his refusal to fully comply. He'd been asked to stop seeing enemies as human, and he'd said no. Not because he was a saint or because he lacked the capacity for hatred, but because he understood that once you start making those distinctions, once you accept that some humans fall outside the circle of moral concern, you've begun the process that leads to the worst things humans do to each other. This is the lesson that transcends the specific circumstances of 1944. We all face versions of this choice, usually in less dramatic forms. We're all constantly being asked to draw lines between us and them, between people who deserve our concern and people who are outside that circle. Sometimes those distinctions are based on nationality, sometimes on race or religion or political affiliation. Sometimes they're subtle, just a gradual erosion of empathy for people who don't look like us or think like us or vote like us. And in each of those moments, we're being asked the same question Brennan faced. Do you actually believe that all humans have equal worth, or do you only believe it when belief is convenient? Will you extend compassion to people you have reasons to hate, or will you let those reasons override your principles? The test isn't whether you can articulate the right answer in a classroom. The test is what you do when helping someone costs you something, when mercy requires sacrifice, when the person who needs your help is someone you'd rather see suffer. Those are the moments when you discover what you actually believe, as opposed to what you'd like to believe about yourself. William Brennan discovered he believed in medicine more than he believed in vengeance. He believed in the principle of healing more than he believed in punishing his enemies. He chose to be a medic even when being a medic meant saving the people who'd been trying to kill him. That choice didn't end the war or change its outcome. It didn't make the Germans less dangerous or American casualties less tragic. It was a small act in the middle of a vast conflict, meaningful primarily to two young men who intersected briefly in circumstances neither had chosen. But small acts accumulate into character, and character determines civilization. The difference between a society that commits atrocities and a society that prohibits them isn't some vast philosophical divide. It's millions of individual moments where people either uphold principles that protect human dignity or find reasons to abandon those principles when they become inconvenient. It's the collective weight of choices made by exhausted, frightened, angry people who had to decide what kind of human they were going to be when being a good human was harder than being a bad one. Brennan's story survived because he told it to his grandchildren, and they remembered it. But for every story that survived, thousands didn't. Thousands of other medics made similar choices or different ones. Thousands of other soldiers faced moral decisions in the mud and the snow and decided to be merciful or vengeful, principled or pragmatic. Most of those stories died with them, unrecorded and forgotten. What made Brennan's story survive wasn't that the choice was unique. It was that someone thought it worth preserving, worth passing down, worth remembering. And maybe that's the real point, that in the middle of humanity's worst self-inflicted catastrophe, in the mud of the Ardennes during the winter of 1945, a 23-year-old medic from Ohio had 30 seconds to decide whether principles meant anything when following them hurt, and he decided they did. He chose to remain human when the easier choice was to stop caring about the humans on the other side. He treated the enemy because treating the enemy was what doctors do, and refusing to do it would have meant becoming something other than a doctor. The German lived. Brennan lived. The war ended. Both men went home and rebuilt their lives and tried to forget the worst parts while remembering enough to stay human. And decades later, in a quiet house in Ohio, an old man told his grandchildren about a choice he'd made in the snow. Not because it made him a hero, not because he wanted praise for doing what the rules required anyway, but because he wanted them to understand that war doesn't have to destroy everything inside you, that you can maintain your humanity even in circumstances designed to strip it away, that the only way to fight monsters is to refuse to become one. That's the philosophical weight at the center of this story, the recognition that we are what we do, especially in the moments when doing the right thing costs us something. that principles without sacrifice are just comfortable lies we tell ourselves, that the test of who you are isn't what you do in ideal circumstances with unlimited resources and perfect information. The test is what you do when you're exhausted and traumatized and have 30 seconds to make a decision that feels impossible, with incomplete information and no good options. Brennan reached into his bag and pulled out the penicillin. That small gesture, repeated millions of times by millions of people making small choices to be decent when decency was difficult, is the thing that separates civilization from barbarism. Not laws or philosophy or grand institutions, though those matter, but the individual human decision made in the moment of crisis to treat other humans as human, even when you have excellent reasons not to. The German soldier recovered. That's how the story ends, factually, but the deeper ending is about what Brennan recovered. He came home with trauma, with nightmares, with memories that never fully faded. But he also came home with the knowledge that war hadn't destroyed the part of himself he most valued. He'd been tested in the most direct possible way, and he'd chosen mercy over vengeance, principle over expedience, humanity over hatred. And maybe that's the only victory that matters in war. Not territory conquered or enemies defeated, but the individual human souls who pass through the machinery of violence and emerge on the other side, still capable of compassion, still committed to principles that transcend tribe and nation, still willing to recognize the humanity in people who tried to kill them. That's not a victory that gets you medals or appears in history books, but it's the kind of victory that lets you live with yourself after the shooting stops. In the frozen forest in the winter of 1945, a young medic made a choice. He saved an enemy's life because the alternative was to become the thing he'd crossed an ocean to fight. It was a small choice in a vast war, but small choices repeated and multiplied across millions of people and thousands of days are what determine whether we remain human or become something less. Brennan remained human. The cost was a vial of penicillin and the weight of wondering whether he'd chosen right. The reward was being able to look at himself in the mirror for the rest of his life without flinching. That's not nothing. In a war that destroyed millions and damaged millions more, being able to keep your humanity intact is an achievement worth remembering. That's why this story matters. Not because it's unique, but because it's universal. We all face versions of this choice. Will we extend compassion to people outside our tribe, or will we reserve it only for those who look like us, think like us, fight for the same flag? Will we uphold principles that protect human dignity, even when doing so costs us something? Or will we find comfortable reasons to abandon those principles when they become inconvenient? The German lived because a 23-year-old medic from Ohio decided that being a doctor meant treating all patients, even the ones wearing enemy uniforms. It was the right choice and the hard choice, and the choice that let him remain who he wanted to be instead of becoming who the war wanted to make him. And if you think about it, if you really sit with it, that's the only choice any of us ever have. Be human when being human is easy, or be human when being human costs you something. The first is comfortable. The second is what determines your character. Brennan chose character. In the mud and the snow and the exhaustion and the grief, he chose to remain human. That choice saved a German soldier, but more importantly, it saved William Brennan. Not his life, but something more essential. His sense of who he was and who he refused to become. War took a lot from him, the way it takes from everyone. But it didn't take that. He wouldn't let it. And 70 years later, that refusal still matters. Because we're still being asked the same question. We're still being offered reasons to stop caring about people outside our circles of concern. We're still being told that our principles are luxuries we can't afford, that survival requires us to harden ourselves, that compassion for enemies is weakness or naivety or betrayal. And we still have to decide, individually and collectively, whether we believe what we say we believe or whether our principles dissolve the moment they become inconvenient. The German got a shot of penicillin in his arm and lived. The American medic got to keep his soul. Both survived the war. Both went home. And somewhere in that frozen forest, in that moment of decision, humanity won a small victory over the forces trying to destroy it. Not a victory that ended the war or prevented future conflicts, but a victory nonetheless, the kind that happens one person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of conscience at a time. That's the story. A medic and a soldier, enemies by circumstance, connected by one moment, where medicine transcended nationality and mercy defeated hatred. It's a small story from a vast war. But small stories, when you look at them closely, contain everything that matters, everything that makes us human, and everything that threatens to strip that humanity away, everything we've been and everything we might still become. Brennan lived to age 87. He died in his sleep, surrounded by family, honored by his community, mourned by the thousands of patients he'd treated over 4 decades of quiet practice. The German, if he lived a normal lifespan, might still be alive today, an old man somewhere with grandchildren who don't fully understand the war that defined his youth. They might not know about the fever or the infection or the American medic who saved him. Stories get lost, even important ones. But the principle doesn't get lost. The question doesn't get lost. We still face it, in forms large and small. Do we treat others the way we'd want to be treated if situations were reversed? Do we uphold human dignity even for people who've wronged us? Do we maintain our principles when maintaining them is difficult? Those aren't historical questions. They're questions we answer every day through our choices and our actions and the moments when we decide who we're going to be. William Brennan answered them in a frozen forest with a vial of penicillin and a dying enemy, and 30 seconds to choose. He answered them by being a medic when being a medic meant healing the people who'd tried to kill him. He answered them by refusing to let war turn him into something he didn't want to become. And that answer, that refusal, that small act of human decency in the middle of history's greatest atrocity, is why his story deserves to be remembered. Not because he was perfect, not because he solved anything, but because he showed that it's possible to remain human even in circumstances designed to destroy humanity. And if he could do it then, in those conditions, with those stakes, maybe we can do it now. Maybe we can choose compassion over convenience, principle over prejudice, humanity over hatred. Maybe we can look at the people we have reasons to dismiss or despise or dehumanize and choose to see them as human anyway. That's the lesson that echoes across the decades. That's what makes this story more than just an anecdote about medicine and war. It's a demonstration, preserved in one small moment of what it means to be human when being human is hardest. And a reminder that we're all constantly choosing, whether we realize it or not, what kind of humans we're going to be. Brennan chose to be the kind who heals, even when the wounded are enemies, even when it costs something, even when it feels like betrayal. Because that's what doctors do, that's what humans do when they're at their best. They recognize suffering and work to relieve it, regardless of where the suffering comes from, or who's experiencing it, or whether that person deserves their help by some tribal calculus of us versus them. The German lived. That's the simplest version of the story. But the full version is about what it means to make someone live when you have every reason to let them die, and what that choice reveals about who you are and who you refuse to become. And that's a story worth remembering, worth preserving, worth passing on. Because we need those reminders. We need to know that it's possible to stay human in inhuman circumstances. We need examples of people who faced impossible choices and made them anyway, who maintained their principles when principles were costly, who chose to be doctors instead of executioners. That's what William Brennan did in the winter of 1945. He gave a dying enemy a chance to live, and in doing so, he gave himself a chance to remain the kind of person who saves rather than abandons, who heals rather than harms, who chooses principle over vengeance even when vengeance would be understandable. And 7 decades later, that choice still matters, still teaches, still reminds us that humanity is a choice we make over and over, in moments large and small, and that the quality of our character is measured by what we choose when choosing right is hardest.